We've talked about the best mid-game spells, but
We're in the endgame now.
so let's look at the biggest, baddest, and deadliest spells in Elden Ring. Here's a list of the best 10 endgame spells to melt bosses and enemies alike. Let's go! As with any list video like this, there is some subjectivity to this, depends what I prefer compared to what maybe you prefer or someone else prefers. So do let me know in the comments down below what your best 10 spells are or your favorite spells. If I missed something on this list, do make sure you let me know. We'll start out with probably my favorite spell in the game, or at least one of them, and that is Adula's Moonblade. This is a sweeping slash with a cold blade projectile. It acts very similar to the Carrion Greatsword spell that you do have, except it has the cold benefits to it as well as frostbite that it does apply on the target. Now, an interesting kind of technique or tech with this spell is that you can hit enemies with the blade as well as the wave, if that makes sense. So when you swing the blade, you can actually hit enemies with that and then as well as the wave rather than hitting them with one or the other. This will basically just mean you get extra damage when you do hit enemies with this and increase your benefits or chances of getting the frostbite effect applied quicker. I really like this spell. It's fantastic to melt bosses, get that frostbite applied so you do extra damage to them, then switch to something else and just kind of melt away the bosses. It's really powerful to use in most situations, especially against big enemies. This is dropped by the Glintstone dragon Adula, located at the Cathedral of Manus Celis. Next is the Great Glintstone Shard, and this is probably the best spammable spell in the game. It has such a low FP cost but still does decent amount of damage, and when you're just exploring, killing random trash mobs, it's probably the spell you're going to use the most in most of those scenarios to keep your FP cost low while just being able to kill enemies and deal as much damage as possible. This is one of those spells that you can get from Sorceress Celine by giving her the Academy Scroll, and an alternative to this as kind of like an end game version that you probably use against bosses for that spamble is Comet. And Comet fires a giant massive comet at the target, and it's a more powerful kind of version of this kind of spammable spell that you'll use. You can actually charge up Comet to do increased damage, and you will use this in some situations against some of the larger enemies and boss fights rather than using Great Glintstone Shard because it doesn't do enough damage, and in those fights it doesn't matter as much about your FP usage as when you're just exploring the open world and just killing the trash mobs, because you're mostly going to have all of your flasks when you are fighting bosses in those scenarios. Continuing our comet trend is the Night Comet, and this fires a semi-invisible magic comet. The interesting thing about the Night Comet and the night spells in general is that enemies won't dodge them. So you'll notice a lot of times as a spellcaster that as soon as you cast a spell, they will always dodge. There's a lot of input reading that happens from enemies in Elden Ring. So essentially every time you do something like that, they will just automatically dodge. Something with Night Comet and these other night spells is that they won't actually dodge them. So they will just take that damage head on. So you can really spam this at enemies and deal consistent damage without having to worry about dodging them. This is really benefit for bosses. A lot of the general trash mobs don't actually dodge these attacks. It's mostly bosses and some of the more sneakier or more agile enemies in the game that will actually dodge them. But it's a great spell to just to keep in your arsenal for those situations where enemies are just going to dodge your normal spells. And this is found in the town of Sorcery in Caelid. It's behind one of those magic barriers that you do find in this section of town, so keep an eye out for that down there. The Ancient Death Rancor is next, and this summons a horde of vengeful spirits that chase down enemies. And similarly to the Night Comet, I put this one on the list because it does do decent damage, but also enemies won't dodge it. Well, technically they do dodge it, it's just that the effect takes so long to reach them that they don't actually dodge. Their dodge has finished, and that's why I think this is really valuable in some situations. And you can actually charge the spell as well to increase its damage and melt away a lot of bosses with this spell. I mostly find that Ancient Death Rancor is more beneficial for bosses, especially larger bosses, because they have a much bigger hitbox, so you can hit enemies with more of the spirits. But I would mostly just be using this spell for those boss fights that maybe they move around a lot, maybe they're very agile. You can just constantly spam this attack. They do a little bit of stagger when the spirits do hit the target, and it's really good in those situations. It's not great against trash mobs, but you can absolutely use it in those scenarios as well. This is dropped by the Deathrite bird in the Lernier of the Lakes, just east of Rey Lucario Academy. So you can get this pretty early in the game. It just has some interesting costs because it is intelligence and faith, but you do use a staff to cast it, so that's why it fits on this list. Next is Loretta's Mastery, which is kind of the souped up version of Loretta's Great Bow, and this fires many great arrows rather than the singular one. This is probably one of the best long range spells in the game, though in some situations the Great Bow is probably preferred because Great Bow is much more accurate, whereas this one some of the arrows will miss or they'll hit other targets just the way the arrows kind of come out. But this is a chargeable spell, so you can charge it up to do more damage, just like the Great Bow. It's a fantastic long range spell to deal damage at high ranges, which is perfect for sorcery builds like this, when you do want to farm enemies from a rather large distance to prevent them from getting to you, so you can kind of cull the numbers that there are before they actually get to you. It's a great spell to use. Even the Great Bow is fantastic for that exact same reason. Next is the Great Blade Phaliax, and this forms a defensive arch around you of larger magic glint blades. Now, this is the Phaliax that I prefer the most. There is some other options like the Carrion Phaliax and some of the minor blades that you can get, but this is probably the best. And the main reason isn't for the damage, it's for the stagger potential that it does. So in a lot of scenarios, this Great Blade Phaliax does the most stagger or stance damage than any of the other Phaliaxes. So you can combine this with other spells that do stagger damage, or even just attacks that do stagger damage, because you can pop this early and then go and reach the enemy and then stagger them. This is why this spell is really valuable in those kind of situations. And you won't use it too much. I only really use it for like my Moonveil build, and I used it a little bit for my Sorcerer build to stagger enemies just to prevent them from getting to me so I could melt them while they were on the ground. But it's a fantastic spell to use regardless. Let's talk buffs. And with buffs for magic users, we don't have as many, but the one that we do have is the Terra Magica. This raises your magic strength for those standing in the sigil on the ground. The sigil on the ground doesn't move, and you can't move it with you, so you will have to cast it and stay in that area, which isn't too bad, especially if you're using it to engage in certain fights or deal damage quickly. Combining it with some of the other spells which we're just about to get into, this will increase the damage while you're standing in there. It gives you a really decent damage bonus. It's something like 30%, so it's well worth getting and picking this up and using it in those scenarios. And you can get this from the Academy Crystal Cave dungeon in that area just near the bosses at the end. And the reason we are using this spell is to combine it with things like the Comet Azur, which is the next one on this list. And the Comet Azur is a tremendous comet that just spawns out of your staff, and you've probably seen this used in some videos. This is a very high range damage spell that is just in a straight line. You can buff it with things like the Terra Magica and other effects, like even talismans you can buff it with. It'll essentially just last until your FP runs out. So if you've got a ton of FP, you can just spam this out in front of you and just melt enemies with it. As long as they stand inside the turret, you will absolutely melt enemies with this attack. It's fantastic to use, and this comes from the Hermit Village in Mount Gilmore, which you can get there, and it's from the Sorcerer Azur himself, who's dead on the ledge near one of the Site of Graces there. Next is the Crystal Torrent, and it's essentially a similar effect to the Comet Azur, except it fires a crystal mass from your staff rather than the Comet effect. And the effect shoots out a little bit more like a shotgun compared to the Comet Azur, and in that regard, it has a little bit more of a range on it in terms of width rather than the Comet, so it's a bit wider, so you can hit enemies that may move around a little bit more. The Crystal Torrent is another alternative to the Comet Azur. Again, it just melts enemies. It does fantastic damage, and you can increase its damage as well by combining it with the Crystallian Staff. And this comes from Caelid. It's dropped by the Putrid Crystallian bosses down in the Celia hideaway at the end of that area if you want to go and pick this up. And next on the list is the Meteorite of Astel, and this calls a hail of small meteorites from the void. Essentially, you slam that staff down into the ground and meteors just start falling from the sky. This has a very high damage output if you can land the meteors. The thing with this is you can't actually aim the meteors, they just kind of spawn and go wherever they like. This spell is perfect for the larger enemies and the larger bosses, because the more meteorites they take, the more damage they're going to take, and you'll be able to spam this for days. And it does function the same as the other two spells on this list, where as long as you hold it and as long as you've got FP, you'll just constantly be spamming them down. And you can combine this with the Terra Magica, although it does do physical damage, so it's well worth pointing that out. It doesn't necessarily do magic damage. I think you get a little bit of an increase, because I think it's like a combination of magic and physical, but it's primarily physical damage, which is also a benefit of this spell, because enemies that have high magic resistance, some of the magic spells don't work too well, and whereas here you've got the alternative of using the spell because of the physical damage that it does. And this comes from Astel, the Star of Darkness, in the Annex Tunnel in the Consecrated Snowfield, so you will have to wait a long way to get this at the end of the game, but we're talking about endgame spells here. It's a perfect one to pick up. That is my list here. Let me know in the comments what you think of this list, what you would change. Thank you for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.